For decades, occupational safety focused almost exclusively on gravity, machinery, and physical exertion. The goal was to keep bodies intact. But today, while catastrophic physical accident rates have broadly declined in developed economies, a different category of harm is surging. Psychosocial risks, work-related stress, anxiety, and depression are becoming the dominant threat to worker health. This shift is a direct result of how modern labor is organized. The economy has rapidly transitioned away from traditional manufacturing towards service sectors, the gig economy, and precarious, non-standard contracts. At the same time, the workforce itself is changing. Europe's labor pool is explicitly aging, and it increasingly relies on migrant labor to fill critical roles. To regulate this complex environment, the European Union relies on the OSH Framework Directive. It establishes the baseline legal standard for occupational safety and health across member states. Embedded within this directive is a strict legal requirement. Employers must adapt the work and the workplace to the individual worker, with a specific mandate to protect particularly sensitive demographic groups. This creates an operational problem. Many safety professionals operate under the assumption that a uniform, colorblind risk assessment policy treats everyone equally. Applying identical safety standards to a highly varied workforce actually results in systemic underprotection. It ignores the compounding pressures that specific groups face. True compliance requires an inclusive risk assessment. This means actively mapping intersectional vulnerabilities and aggressively managing the psychosocial risks that stem from them. Applying a one-size-fits-all safety policy in a diversified, gig-enabled economy does not equate to neutrality. It equates to operational negligence. In occupational health, vulnerability is not an inherent weakness. Vulnerable workers are simply groups exposed to increased risks due to their personal characteristics, their specific employment conditions, or a combination of both. We can visualize this through a vulnerability matrix. The horizontal axis tracks employment precariousness, ranging from permanent roles to temporary gig work. The vertical axis measures personal vulnerability factors, like age, language barriers, or physical disabilities. Consider young workers. They frequently report high exposure to verbal abuse, often lacking the experience and maturity to de-escalate confrontational situations and service roles. Older workers face different pressures. Alongside natural sensory and physical changes, data shows they receive significantly fewer professional development and training opportunities compared to their younger peers, increasing job-related stress. Migrant workers often plot in the highest risk quadrant. They navigate language barriers, poor communication with supervisors, and the intense psychological frustration of being overqualified for low-skilled positions. Even in standard employment, historical and ongoing risks persist for female workers. Women are disproportionately represented in occupations characterized by monotonous, repetitive tasks that offer little to no operational autonomy. This occupational stress is compounded by the double role, the combined burden of paid employment and disproportionate hours of unpaid domestic labor, impacting work-life balance. When individuals from these demographic groups are placed into low-skilled or temporary jobs, the structure of the work itself strips away the autonomy and resources they need to cope with their compounding personal stressors. High-risk profiles are engineered exactly where precarious employment structures meet marginalized identities. The structure of the work is often the hazard itself. Precarious employment includes temporary work, seasonal labor, part-time jobs, and zero-hour contracts. The primary mechanism of harm here is perceived job insecurity. This flowchart illustrates how combining high workload demands with low institutional support predictably triggers acute stress and depression. The data from the 2021 European Working Conditions Telephone Survey confirms this model. 26% of workers in precarious situations report difficulty making ends meet, injecting constant financial unpredictability into their daily lives. Workplace discrimination acts as an accelerating vector for this stress, disproportionately targeting minorities, women, and older workers. The same survey found that 11% of the workforce reports facing active discrimination. These traditional risks are now being amplified by the rapid expansion of digital platform work and algorithmic management. In these environments, algorithms dictate the pace of work. Digital surveillance intensifies demands while simultaneously isolating workers from professional peers and human support systems. Instead of leveling the playing field, platform work often reinforces existing inequalities, frequently trapping skilled migrant workers in low-level, high-stress roles despite their actual qualifications. In the modern economy, exploitative contracts and optimization algorithms are occupational hazards just as potent as unguarded machinery. Because these hazards are intersectional, the methodology used to identify them requires a structural overhaul. To meet legal mandates, EU OSHA outlines a 9-step inclusive risk assessment framework. It begins at the executive level, taking diversity seriously, actively rejecting assumptions about who is at risk, and structurally matching the work to the worker's specific capabilities. Next, organizations must link occupational safety directly to HR equality initiatives. This requires training risk assessors explicitly in diversity issues and delivering tailored safety training to staff in their native languages. Finally, the assessment must actively involve the workers themselves, basing its findings on real, observed situations rather than theoretical manuals, and seeking outside specialist advice when necessary. A traditional safety assessor evaluating a warehouse for trip hazards and proper lifting technique will entirely miss the psychological toll of algorithmic pacing or subtle racial harassment on the floor. For safety managers to see these hidden risks, they require rigorous, gender-sensitive, and culturally aware training. A risk assessment is only legally and operationally sound if it actively hunts for cultural and structural disparities. Identifying the problem is only the diagnostic phase. The subsequent step is executing concrete prevention measures. Organizationally, employers must close the resource gap. Temporary, part-time, and gig workers require equal access to employer-paid professional and safety training, which is too often reserved only for permanent staff. This is particularly critical in high-risk sectors, like healthcare and hospitality, where diverse, intersectional teams frequently interact with patients and the public. To combat third-party harassment, management must establish strict, zero-tolerance standards for client and customer behavior, protecting young and female staff from verbal and sexual abuse. Work schedules must be redesigned to eliminate lone working scenarios, particularly during night shifts or in isolated cleaning roles, where risks of physical violence spike. Environmental upgrades are also mandatory. This includes installing robust security surveillance, ensuring well-lit exits, and providing personal emergency communication systems to vulnerable staff. Furthermore, organizations should deploy targeted stress management training, equipping these groups with specific coping mechanisms calibrated to their unique risk profiles. True prevention requires modifying the physical environment, the corporate policy, and the employment contract. It is never sufficient to merely ask a vulnerable worker to be more resilient. Workplace vulnerability is fundamentally a systemic issue. It is driven by the volatile intersection of personal identity and precarious work structures. Non-standard contracts, algorithmic isolation, and low autonomy roles must be treated as primary occupational health hazards. They require the same rigorous mitigation as any physical danger. Resolving these intersectional risks requires breaking down internal silos. Human resources policy, daily operations, and health and safety management must interlock and function as a single system. This brings us back to the core mandate of the EU Framework Directive. The ultimate goal is to adapt the work to the individual, never the reverse. Deploying an inclusive risk assessment framework translates legal compliance into a measurable operational advantage. By actively mapping and mitigating intersectional vulnerability, we create the blueprint for engineering a demonstrably safer, highly resilient modern workforce.